Hey, everybody, Brian Beckham here, and I have got Xavier Naville. Xavier, how you doing today, man?
I'm very good, Brian. Thanks a lot for having me here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I got to tell you, right at the beginning, you have an absolutely fascinating background in biography, and especially I think for Americans who sometimes can, they don't have maybe quite as much, at least historically, experience in different parts of the world. You're a Frenchman who has spent a lot of time in China. You currently live, I think, in Oakland, California. You split time between Oakland and China. You're quadrilingual, and you're also the author of a book, the Lettuce Diaries, and the subtitle. I love the subtitle: How a Frenchman Found Gold Growing Vegetables in China. So thank you for coming on the show. I mean, truly a remarkably interesting background. So before we get into your book, some of the leadership principles you follow, some of your experiences in China, tell the listeners a little bit about your background, who you are, what you do, how you ended up where you are today.
So I'm French, so you should not say too loud. We sometimes have a bad reputation. I grew up like a normal Frenchman in France. I did not travel much. My parents were blue collars. My father was a chef. My mom was a nurse. They were running some small hotels for a state-owned company or quasi-state-owned company in France. And so I grew up in hotels, and I saw sailors all my life, and I had this idea that I would travel. So at 27, I was a young financier in France, a bit technocratic, and here goes the snobbish Frenchman that I describe in the book. And I had a chance to go as an expat, as a finance director, in China for the multinational, the food service multinational I was working with, called Compass. You probably know Aramark in the US.
Oh yeah, sure. Huge company. Yeah.
So Compass is bigger than Aramark. It's number one or number two in the world.
Wow.
So I went there in China to participate in the growth of a food service staff canteen management business. And 2 years into it, I started a company called Creative Food that made the shredded lettuce that goes into the burger of KFC and McDonald in China. So growing vegetables in China with Chinese farmers, processing them in factories and selling them to McDonald and KFC. And over the course of 7-8 years, I grew this business to what is today a $150 million business with 1,500 employees and 9 factories in China. And I expanded the range to become the fresh food guy for all the big restaurant chains. So if you go to Starbucks in China and you eat a sandwich or pastry or a salad or soup, it's likely that it comes from Creative Food factories.
Nice.
I had sold the business in 2007 to a London-listed company called Bakkavor. And that does exactly the same type of product for all the big UK retailers, Marks & Spencer, Tesco, and so on. And I ran it for a few years, and then I left. So in 2012, I decided to write this book. It took me a few years to write it. And I moved to the US in 2015, essentially driven by the fact that I adopted a little girl. So my number 3 is adopted, and we had to be permanent resident in the US to give her citizenship. So that's my personal story.
Nice. So let's go into a little bit more detail. We were talking before we went on the show. I had a U.S. congressman on the show about a year ago, a guy named Will Hurd. Will Hurd was an undercover CIA agent in the Middle East before he was a congressman. He's a computer scientist by training, and he is a China expert. And boy, the podcast with Will is, if you're interested in China and geopolitics and business and things like that, he has a tremendous amount of knowledge about the region. But what was it about? How does as you describe it, a snobbish Frenchman? How does a snobbish Frenchman? And what was it about China in particular that drew you there?
So that's a good point, because I had no particular attraction to China. Many of my friends who speak fluently Chinese grew up reading legends about China or books about China. They decided to study Chinese and moved to China and became entrepreneurs. I was a businessman. I was given a chance between India and China. I flew to India. From India, I flew to China. I looked at the thousands of cranes that were covering Shanghai in 1997. At the time, they were saying that one crane out of three in the world were in Shanghai.
Wow.
And I looked at that city and I said, I feel like I'm on the forefront, on the front line of what's going on in the world. So I want to be here. So it was not about China. It was about a business opportunity. I wanted to spend 2 years in China and then essentially get the job I wanted anywhere else in the world. I ended up spending close to 2 decades in China, and I don't regret it.
So, and I think that some Americans can tend to be a little parochial or a little unsophisticated about overseas, Europe, China, places like that. And I think some people may have the mistaken impression, we think of China as a communist country, which it is obviously, but it's kind of a, the old communist countries, Russia, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc countries, the notion there, I think, was there was no private property. And communist China, I think, is a little bit different in that regard. So explain for the people that aren't familiar with how the Chinese Communist Party and capitalism work together. How does that work on the ground in China?
Okay, so that's a very complex point, and I have to be really careful not to draw broad lines about China because obviously it's a complicated place. I guess the most important thing to understand for anybody who's not familiar with China is that China tried the whole communist experience. So the communists took power in 1949, kicked out the nationalists at the time who moved to Taiwan or escaped to Taiwan. They experimented with communal farm, the equivalent of the Russian sovkhos or kolkhos. And that didn't work. For 20 years, they tried to manage the farms in China, and they got into gigantic famines because the farmers were just not motivated. If you ask a farmer to operate a farm and then the fruit of this farm is going to be shared equally among everybody, he loses total motivation. So total agriculture output dropped in China, did not work. They went into the Cultural Revolution, which was completely ideological. And when Deng Xiaoping took over in the late 70s, he started to look at the country situation, a country that was extremely poor on global ranks, and said, we got to try something else. And he had this famous sentence, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And his point was, we're going to introduce market reforms in this country. We're going to try something else. We're going to let some people get rich first. And then we'll figure out how we rebalance all that and reconcile with the communist ideology. So essentially, since the early 80s until essentially this year, China has introduced a number of market reforms. It's sometimes more state-directed than the US likes to describe capitalism. But as a European, it doesn't look too far away from what our governments do in Europe. They're more involved in the economy and the planning of the economy. So they introduced the right for people in the mid-90s. They introduced the right for people to start their own business. Many of them actually took assets from state-owned companies and spun them off to create new businesses. People were allowed to buy their properties, their real estate properties, on a system that is, here's the trick with the communist ideology. In China, the land belongs to the people. So when you own property or farmland, you've got a right for several years that is similar to the leasehold system that you have in the UK. So if you own property, often it ranges between 25 and 35 years of rights. So essentially you trade it the way anybody would trade it in the US, but you don't have a full right to the property. It's not a freehold like you would call it in the UK. It's a leasehold. So, and as far as business is concerned, you can own your company, you can have your shares, and you can operate it like anywhere else.
Which is different from the traditional notions of communism. And, you said something early on there, Xavier, that I think I've actually been thinking about quite a bit for a few years. You were talking about the planned farms and how when the farms were planned and the end result was going to be essentially somebody else's, that the farmers lost motivation to work, and it didn't work the way people wanted it to work. And I think if you look historically, of course, that's generally true. People need to have some sort of incentive to work that gives them a feeling that they and their family or they and their close ones will be able to benefit from it. But on the flip side of that, I think sometimes, particularly in America, we go too far the other way. And so we have this notion in America that, individual freedom, 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 but we forget about the fact that the state does play a role. And the biggest example I can think of that is the military. The military is the biggest socialist organization in the United States. If by socialist you mean you're subsuming your own individual wants and needs for the greater good. And so that balance, I think in America right now, this is just my personal opinion, we may have gone a little bit too far in the individualist direction, and whereas in other countries maybe they go too far in the collectivist direction. And it seems to me that there's kind of almost a middle path, kind of where you have a balance of both individual liberty, individual freedom, but you also recognize that, hey, as human beings, we're all on the same sphere together, and there are problems that we have to work together to solve. And so what was your experience like when you were in China? What was when you first got there, the most surprising thing to you about doing business in China?
That's a very good that's a good question. And I'm trying to answer in a thoughtful way without making a general statement that would oversimplify things. I would say that I was really impressed by how practical the Chinese were and how flexible and creative they were. They loved to solve problems, and nothing was ever a problem. So somebody was telling me one day that Chinese can appear, from our point of view, from the Western point of view, shy or reserved, because they're not going to volunteer information. They're not going to be marketing themselves or promoting themselves the way we tend to learn how to do at university here in the Western system. But they're incredibly creative. And that creativity only happens within a safe space. So a Chinese friend was telling me, Chinese people are really shy, but if you've ever been to karaoke with a Chinese person, you know that they're not shy when they sing in the mic. And the reason is it's a closed room, it's a group of friends. We know that whatever happens here is not going to leave that room, and I go wild. And I guess that one of the things you learn as a businessman or as a leader in China is that this is a collective culture. A lot of your employees and management come from very far away. They're not people from the same town. And the company is much more than just a job for them. It's a place of social interaction. Usually they go back to a home where they have no friend, no network, and they see the company as the place that is supposed to give them a salary, a career, a personal development, but also a safe space where they can share with friends and feel secure. So I guess what surprised me the most, to come back to your question, is how collective the culture was and how important it was as a leader to create that safe harbor where people could blossom and give their best. And that's something that was hard because, you know, at the beginning I had these slides and I would have these very inspiring quotes from Churchill and Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, and
Yeah,
people
yeah.
would look at me and they had no idea what I was talking about. And even if I explained what it was, they just could not understand it. It just did
Yeah.
not make any sense for them. So I don't know if I'm answering the way you want to hear it, but that's a bit what that's where I found gold. I would
Yeah.
say that's where that's not about the money. It's about this discovery that you can function in a completely different culture. I was very parochial. When I say snobbish, Frenchman, it
Yeah.
means that I had this idea that France is this amazing place, this amazing country, and
Yeah.
I'm going to arrive in China, and this is an underdeveloped country, and they will graduate one day to the same stage of development that we went through, and I'm going to help them do that.
Yeah.
And I realized that things were completely different. They came from a completely different historical context. They socialized differently, and it was for me to learn rather than them to learn from me.
What a great point you just made at the end. I've talked to a bunch of, frankly, phenomenal leaders during the almost 50 shows I've done now. And one of the things that I hear again and again and again from leaders from all different sorts of walks of life, people that don't know each other, is this idea that leaders are servants. And so what you just said there, I think, is exactly on point with that idea. And that is, it's not my people's job to adapt to me necessarily. It's my job as the leader to adapt to them. It's my job to listen to what they have to say and their concerns, and mold what I do based on my team's abilities. It kind of reminds me, Xavier, of a sports coach. I don't know if you follow any sports, but if to me, the best coaches are the coaches that when they come in, they don't try to fit the team into their system. They fit, they figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of their players are, and then they design the system around their players. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, that's very correct, and it's true in China in a completely different cultural environment. Obviously, you arrive there as a leader, you'd better learn. I did not learn for a couple of years. I run that company like I was George Patton, and I drove it on the brink of bankruptcy. And I tell the
Yeah.
story of all the mistake I made that
Yeah.
got me on the brink of bankruptcy. And I wanted to talk about the mistakes because it's not fun to read about somebody's success. And I felt that
Yeah.
many of the magazines talk about business success as a linear story. And I wanted to show the anxiety, the agonizing moments when you
Yeah.
have complex trade-off to make. And I wanted to talk about that in a non-linear way and go see the ups and downs. So what I learned, and I did not do it intentionally at the beginning, is that you get much more from people if you just say, I don't know. Listen, I screwed up yesterday, or I lost my temper. I was a dick. You're better at me than that.
Yeah.
Can you help me? I learned that when you do that, you get much more from people, not in a manipulative way, but you get that level of safety that I talked about earlier, where people feel that it's okay to talk about things. So you talk about a servant. I use the word privilege.
Yeah.
I'm a business coach. I've got clients, and sometimes my clients say, "Well, if I say I don't know, or if I say I need help, am I going to look weak?" I said, "No, you're not going to look weak. You're just showing them what it is to be a leader, and you're showing them that it's a privilege, that you have the responsibility of people's life, and that you're taking that privilege very seriously by asking their input. And what happens also is that on the other hand, people see what it takes to be a leader, the responsibilities that come with it, and they train themselves. And you're modeling for them the behaviors that you expect from a leader. And when your entire organization start to think like leaders at their own level, then you know that you've got something going on for you. And that's what I did successfully when I turned around the company after pivoting from a much more directive type of leadership to a more humble servant type of leadership.
So I want to talk about that, what you're talking about in a little more detail, if that's okay with you. And I know you talk about this in great detail in your book, which I would encourage everybody. It's the Lettuce Diaries. Everybody to order. It's a really, really interesting look at business. It's an interesting look at culture. It's an interesting look at success and failure. But talk a little bit more about the I think this notion that you just brought up, Xavier, about and I would describe it as maybe showing some vulnerability, maybe is the way to put it. Like the people, my experience has been, I used to think that if I showed any vulnerability at all as a lawyer, if I told people that I had any issues at all or anxiety, I would look weak. And people would say, well, that's not the lawyer that I want to hire. That's not the person that I need, somebody that doesn't have any weaknesses at all. And what I found over probably the last 4 or 5 years is I think people respond a lot more powerfully to people that show some vulnerability, to people that show they're not perfect, people that are, you know, for instance, I used to be scared to death of losing a case in court. I was afraid if I lost a case, everybody would think I was a failure. You're terrible. I never get any business. So what I've since found out, I think, is people actually, people admire people that are willing to go into the arena and fight, and they don't really care that much about whether they win or lose. It's the fact that they have the courage to go in there and do battle or do business or whatever it is. But tell us about some of the, because again, I think this idea of the struggles, the obstacles that people overcome, that's the most interesting thing to me and a lot of people. What were some of the struggles? Like you said, the business was going, I think you said it was about to go bankrupt and you had to turn it around. Tell us a little bit more about some of those struggles that you had.
Well, I think the biggest mistake I made when I came in is, and everything, sorry, I'll come back to everything you're saying about vulnerability, and I think it's really important. But the biggest mistake I made when I came in is I came in looking at China from my Western lens, and you know, I was trying to launch this bag salad business for the food service restaurants. And this is a category that had exploded in the US. I don't know if you remember the late 90s, US Californian farming operations started to cut and clean the salads and put them in bags. And today it's a $10 billion category in the US market. So I came to China saying, I'm going to bring that. And I brought it the Californian way. So I brought gigantic pieces of equipment, expats from California, and I said, I'm going to replicate California in China, and I'll serve the Japan market 3 days away by boat rather than 2 weeks away from California. And the mistake I made is that California is a place where you can grow produce 11 months out of 12.
Yeah, sure.
It serves 70% of the needs of the US market from California. Yeah. You've got trucks to travel. In China, there's not one region where you can grow more than 3 months. So you can imagine that if you've got giant pieces of equipment or tractors, you've got to spend enormous amount of money moving them around everywhere. And China is full of mountains. A lot of the fields were on slopes, so you couldn't even bring a tractor in that environment. So my biggest mistake was to arrive and assume that because it worked elsewhere, it would work in China. And I did not listen. By not listening, I created distrust because people saw me heading straight for certain solution, rushing to conclusions, dismissing their advice. And as I said before, Chinese people can sometimes be very indirect and reserved in the way they present advice. So you got to decode it. It doesn't come straight to your face.
Yeah, sounds like my wife.
Yeah, my wife is pretty straight. Trust me.
Yeah, actually, mine can be pretty straight about certain things too.
So I guess the biggest challenge I faced is that I had this idea that a leader had to be like George Patton. He had to be complete. He had to be omniscient. And there was this voice in me in all the meetings that was saying, you know, there was always issue I did not know about: the role of the government, the local regulation, the way of doing things, the way of negotiating that was completely different. And I had this voice that was telling me, you're such a fraud. You've got the hat, you're the CEO, and you can't even answer that question. You're such a fraud. So this whole imposter syndrome that people talk about. And I guess the expressing and having the courage to express that you're vulnerable, that you don't know, that you need help, create that atmosphere where people say, okay, I can step in. Maybe I can share my advice in a safe way because he doesn't know better anyway. So one
Yeah.
of the things I did, for example, is that I couldn't speak proper Chinese. So it was really hard. Once I turned around the company, I had to let go of all the expats. Nobody spoke English. I had this ragtag group of people who didn't speak a word of English
Yeah.
reporting directly to me. And when people called me, I was shaking because I was saying, I'm supposed to be that decisive leader that inspires everybody. And I'm going to make them repeat 3 times their advice. Guess what happened? People figured out that my Chinese was not good enough for them to ramble about stuff. So they prepared much more carefully their calls because they knew that if they prepared well, I would make decisions on the go, quickly on the phone.
Yeah.
I could not read emails in Chinese.
Yeah.
So I was people realized that there was no long memo, there was no long preamble in a phone call. They had to be very prepared. And they got into that format of 1, 2, 3, presenting the issue. And then they would say, this is what I think we should do. And I'm asking for approval. And I would say, yes, in Chinese, which was about as
Yeah.
limited as my Chinese was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And little by little created that atmosphere where people said, okay, I'm really empowered. I can really do things. Research shows that most employees in organizations in the US consider that they give only 50% of what they have to give.
Yeah.
And the reason they do that is they usually have leaders who are not really inquisitive about how to solve the issues in the best way. Sometimes you've got a smart guy who wants to prove that he's the smartest in the room and tell you how much he knows compared to you. So I guess what I did to turn around this company is have the courage to express that I was incomplete, that I would never be complete. I quieted down that little voice in my mind that kept telling me I was a fraud.
Yeah.
And I genuinely asked for help. Now, it's a fine line because vulnerability teaches people to come forward. It also teaches them that it's complex to be a leader, and it prepares them for themselves to become leaders. But at some point, you're still the boss, and you still have to hold people accountable. And that's fine line between expressing vulnerability to bring in people and create that safe space and holding accountability. That's the core of the model that I think I'm trying to explain to you here. At some point, you have to set objectives for people, and then you have to hold them accountable. You don't need to do that in a dictatorial fashion, but you have to hold people accountable. The person who does it probably the best is the former CEO of Ford, Alan Mulally, who used to be the CEO of Boeing too. And I have the story of him telling one of his senior managers when he arrived at Ford, he was a very genuine guy, very simple, very, very straightforward. And somebody said, I can't attend the weekly meeting that you want to create because I'm going to travel and I'm too busy, I can't attend. And he said, well, that's an important meeting. So if you can't attend that meeting, that's fine. We can still have a sandwich together, but you can't work here.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, Xavier, you said so much there, and I'm almost getting goosebumps with some of the things you said. And the reason for that is, or one of the reasons for that is because what I found doing this show is that good leaders like you, there's patterns, and people tend to say the same thing again and again. So for example, you brought up this idea of, I think you were talking about solutions and safe spaces and giving people an opportunity to do more than just put forth 50% of the effort. And one of the rules that I've had at my office for a very long time is people are not allowed to come to me with problems unless they also have some solutions that they propose. Telling people what the problems are, I can hire almost anybody to tell me what the problems are. What I tell the people that work for me is, I hired you to help me solve these problems. I like to think that I'm not. I like to think that I'm fairly intelligent, but I don't know everything. And in fact, the people that work for me in many areas of my business know more about it than I do. And so Why do I have, I think there's basically, like you're talking about George Patton, which I think is a good example. I think there's basically two kinds of, in general, two kinds of leaders. There's leaders that think they know everything, and they may be awesome leaders for a little while, but in the long term, there's no way for one person's brain, I don't care how smart they are, how good of a leader they are, to beat 100 or 1,500 or 1,000 or 20 people's brains. And so, I think one of the problems with I don't know if you want to call it authoritarian type of leadership or the General Patton type of leadership, where the people come to you with the problems and you make the decisions about how to solve the problems. There's a limit to how much you can get done with one person solving the problems. Whereas if you have a whole group of people and they feel comfortable solving problems, then you essentially, you just multiply or exponentially your ability to solve problems. And the other thing you do, and I'll tell you a quick story, Xavier. I worked I've had my own business for over 20 years now, but before that, I worked at a business that had two partners, and the partners were very, very different. One partner was give me a list of 100 things, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And that's what I would do. But that would be all I would do, was the things that he was barking orders at me to do. I had the other partner, by contrast, would give me projects, and he would say, here's a project, here's another project. I want you to go solve this. Like, I want you to go solve this. If you have questions along the way, come to me, ask me questions, but otherwise just go to run these projects. And I tell you what I found, Xavier. Like I said, with the first guy, I did nothing but the task list he gave me. With the second guy, who I felt like trusted me, I felt like I felt like this trust kind of gave me a much bigger feeling of responsibility. I'm like, man, I got to do a good job for this guy because he trusts me to come up with my own solutions. He's not just barking orders at me. So the thing you said earlier about giving 50% of your work, I think part of the reason that employees can get like that is because they don't feel like they have any autonomy. And, another little point about that, and this is going to be kind of funny to say, but, I've read a number of studies that say the number one thing for employees is not their salary. It's not how much money they make. Now, obviously, you got to make a living wage. You got to make good money. But at some point, the most important thing is having a feeling of autonomy, having a feeling that you are contributing to the mission of the organization, and having a feeling that the mission of the organization is worthwhile. And so, I had an employee leave about 10 years ago because another company was offering her $5,000 raise. And I told her, I said, man, I just don't think that's a good idea, basing your decision on just that little bit of money, because you're not going to have the kind of autonomy that you have. And of course, she left and she was back like 6 months later. So talk a little bit more about, we hear these words like empowering employees and things like that, but give us some specific examples of like some of the things you do, and they can be from the book or elsewhere, about how you motivate your people to do what they need to do.
Yeah, so I mean, these are all very, very good point. I would just add one point of nuance, is that the mistake that most leaders do is they lead in the same way. They lead employees, they lead all employees in the same way.
Excellent point.
If you had to separate, I mean, some employees have very high motivation, some have very low motivation. Some employees are really skilled, some are less skilled. In my case, in China, a lot of the young employees at the beginning, they were less skilled. Today, you have a whole new generation of managers who've been trained for 20 years in multinationals. They're much more competent. When I started, I didn't have that base to work from. So when you have somebody who is extremely skilled and highly motivated, you do what what the other partner was doing with you. You give him a project and you're more coaching him.
Yeah.
that person is just going to roll with it, and he's going to feel empowered. He's going to feel that he can develop himself in this organization. When you've got somebody who is highly motivated but low skilled, then you need to be a bit more engaged, and you can't just give them a project and tell them to figure it out, because they just have no idea. And the danger you have is that people just don't dare to come and ask for questions. So that's a bit, it's just the nuance that I'm saying, that you have to lead differently. You have to lead different people differently as a leader, and that's one of the skill that you want to recognize. But I completely agree with the fact that if you're the smartest man in the room and you're telling everybody what to do, you're probably in the wrong room. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And what you said about treating people differently, I 100% agree with that. I think that is a phenomenal observation. And it's like a lot of the times, because I grew up as an athlete, I think about these things. I think about sports metaphors and stuff. And a really good coach doesn't, for example, scream and yell at every single player the exact same way. A really good coach is somebody who tries to figure out what's in this person's mind, what will motivate this person, what's the right approach. And this, by the way, this gets back, I think, to what we were talking about earlier. This is kind of a similar concept, and that's good leaders don't try to impose their will on everybody. They try to figure out what buttons can I push, and not in a manipulative way, but what motivational buttons can I push? What kind of things can I say? What words and noises can I make that will really reach this person? And I'll tell you the other thing, I try to keep this in mind. Sometimes maybe I'm not the best communicator with my wife or, my brother or something like that. And my tendency, Xavier, is it's all their fault. They're not listening to what I'm saying. And really what I should be doing is saying, it's my fault. I'm the one trying to communicate. And if they're not getting what I'm saying, I need to think about not what they're doing wrong, but what I'm doing wrong. Because if you really want to communicate with people, if you really want to persuade people, if you really want to motivate people, the in my opinion, at least, maybe the number one thing to do is to figure out what motivates them, because what motivates them or what motivates you may not necessarily motivate them. So terrific point. The other thing you mentioned is this notion of asking for help. And I think that notion actually kind of goes both ways. Like a good leader has, I think there's this notion that, from some people that a leader may not necessarily want to ask for help, because like we were talking about earlier, there's this concept that, oh, maybe that's showing weakness. But in fact, at least in my opinion, when a leader's asking somebody for help, what he or she is really doing is showing confidence and showing self-assurance and saying, I'm not afraid to let people know that I don't know everything, right? And it's the same.
When you're asking for help, the way you describe it, you're essentially losing control of how people will react to your behavior. And that takes tremendous courage. Because you're just saying, this is the way I feel, and I hope you understand that. I guess you were asking me, what kind of specific action did I take to build that culture where people would feel empowered, and you use the word multiplying, and these are all good metaphors. I think the one thing I did well, but not intentionally, that I try to do more intentionally with entrepreneurs I work with today, is to build a culture. It's three legs, essentially. One is, establishing core values. What are we as a company? Not stuff that we want to be. 62% of companies, I think, have honest in their core values. And I think Enron had it too when they went bust. And you know what they did? It was completely dishonest. So the core values are important because it helps you to recruit people and to make sure that when you grow, you're not bringing in people who are going to dilute your culture. You want people who share your core value.
Let me pause real quick, because I think that's so important, what you just said, this idea of culture. And I think, in my own personal life, there was a time when I thought, mission statements and statements of purpose and stuff were kind of consultant, this is not really that important. This is just a way for McKinsey to make a bunch of money. But tell me if you agree with this, Xavier. One of the things I think this is so important to have these principles or these statements of culture like you're talking about is because it's a kind of, it's a compass, essentially. It gets everybody kind of pointing in a certain general direction. You don't have to all do exactly the same thing all the time, but if you have a kind of a shared culture and a shared purpose, at least your compass, everybody's compass is pointing in the same general direction. So what do you think about that?
That's correct. That's a compass. You use the word compass. I would add framework.
Yeah.
What is the most difficult thing you have to learn to do when you become a leader of a company or when you scale your company? It's to say no. And that kind of cultural environment gives you a framework to say no. So if you've got a clear purpose, the purpose is why your company exists. In my case, at the time, I was not arty. My purpose was more about survival when I was turning around. But if I had to be honest and say, if I had to do it again, I would say my purpose was to create a business model that generated a steady income for the millions of Chinese farmers who've been whiplashed for 40 years in the different reforms of the communist government. And this is something that goes well beyond the profit. Of course, I have to make money, but by being the guy who buys lettuce every day, because I had to make lettuce every day for KFC and McDonald, I'm providing them a model that allows them to not depend on the fluctuation, the boom and bust of the wholesale market. So that if I had to say it again, it's much easier for employees to rally around a purpose like that, because in China, everybody is one or two generations away from grandparents or parents who were farmers. Yeah. So they're very close to the ground, to the soils, to the life at the farm, much more than we are here in the West. So that's something that resonates for people. They say, okay, this company is going to help whoever, my uncle, cousin, grandfather, great-grandfather, make more money because they're providing a sustainable and enduring business model. The core value, I talked about it, helps you to dismiss people who are toxic in your organization or hire people who meet your core value. And the third leg of that culture is a very clear vision. Some sort of a North Star so that everybody's that. Now, what's left to do as a leader is that when you've got a complex project that comes in that the salespeople want to push forward, the three questions I always asked was, does it further our purpose? Is it in line? Does it help keep growing the income of our farmers? Yeah. 2, is it in line with our core values? Are we doing something that that is against our core values? 3rd, does it help us progress to our 10-year vision? And if the answer is no to that, it's much easier for the people to accept, and you get a much higher level of commitment on the execution of the decision you've made than if you just single-handedly decide, nah, that's not what we're going to do because I am the CEO and you've got to listen to me. So yeah. I always try to ask these 3 questions and it allowed people. So that's a very practical first step to create that culture, that vulnerability-led company. You still have to hold people accountable down the road, but that's a good start.
That you said something. You said a number of things that I think are really worth emphasizing. One of the things you said, and I've mentioned this on the podcast many times, is it took me until I'm 40. I'm about to be 49. It took me until about 41 to realize that life is not all about me and what I can do for myself. And you were talking about the mission statement or the purpose statement being about providing jobs and opportunities for literally thousands of people. And of course you have to make money. I totally agree with that. Like my business, I'm in business to make money. I have to make money in order to do all the other things I want to do. But the nice thing about the mission statement that I heard was it wasn't about you, Xavier. It wasn't about what I can do for myself. It wasn't about how I can become the most famous CEO and expatriate CEO in China or something like that. It was about what you could do for other people. And what I found is, yeah, I have energy when I'm doing something for myself. Yeah, I can get a little motivated when I'm doing something for myself. But when I feel like I'm doing something to help another person or other people, I have far more energy. I'm far more optimistic. I'm far more willing to work longer hours because I feel like I'm part of a bigger purpose than just
Mm.
myself. So speak to that a little bit if you don't mind, Xavier.
So what is the alternative if you don't have a purpose? And to be honest with you, I did not always articulate it that clearly.
Yeah.
It's the fact that I wrote this book that helped me
Yeah.
articulate that, and I try
Yeah.
to do that with people I work with now. But what's the alternative? If you don't have a purpose and you're only profit driven, you get into this situation that are driven by greed, and
Yeah.
you've got all sorts of moral hazards. If you don't care enough about profit, then you're a non-profit. So
Yeah.
what's the point, right?
or bankrupt. Yeah.
So having a clear purpose is brings you a compass, a framework, as you said, and it helps people rally when the profit is not there. For example, when things are tough and people get laid off, and it helps you get up in the morning when everything else goes wrong because you have this purpose that is
Yeah.
meaningful. And you said people don't leave companies because of salary. That's one of the things that rank well above salary. People
Yeah.
work in teams and organization that have a purpose that they believe in,
Yeah.
and articulating that purpose. And I wanted to come back on the point that you made when you said, oh yeah, I thought the mission statement and the purpose was all McKinsey and consultant talk and was making them money. I was like you. I
Yeah.
was exactly like you. I said, this is a
Yeah.
bunch of boards that you have in a meeting room on the wall. And if there is one advice I would give to any leader or any entrepreneur is that this is, you own that. You own the
Yeah.
culture. It's not HR job. You're the one who models that culture. And that is so important because it underpins everything else. All the
Yeah.
behavior, the recruitment of employees, the dismissal of employees has to be done in the context of this three-legged framework:
Yeah.
purpose, core value, and long-term vision. Otherwise, you're not credible. Now, what most companies do is they define that and then they put it on walls, and this thing is not alive. And
Yeah.
it's something that's delegated to HR, and that's why it's lost total credibility with people like you and me. Um,
Yeah.
I, I mean, I used to call it the soft stuff. Remember, I'm a finance guy. I think that
Yeah.
running an ex,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought that
I'm
running,
a computer science guy by training. So I'm kind of the same way. I'm like an engineer. I'm a science guy, right?
I thought that because I had put the figures on Excel, everything else should just follow.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, you were talking earlier about something that I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about, because I think it's something that for sure I've experienced, and I know that probably a lot of people listening have experienced, and that is this voice in your head that sometimes tells you you're a phony or you're a fraud. Like I've had this little voice in my head for decades now that says, you're not good enough. If people really knew who you really were or what you were thinking about, they wouldn't be quite as impressed with you. And the image that you give off to the world is one image, when in reality, you're just barely hanging on some of the time, and you're not quite as good as you let off. So talk a little bit about, because I think there's a lot of people that feel this little voice in their head. And what do you do when you hear that voice to kind of overcome it or silence it, or whatever you want to say?
I guess, yeah, you're right. We all have that voice. And one of the things I wanted to do when I wrote the book is express that voice and think
Yeah.
very clearly about what it meant and what I
Yeah.
was feeling at the time, and try to express it clearly on paper. And that's one of the things that people resonate with. People who have nothing to do with China, they said, I've been through that. I know what it is. At some point,
Yeah, for
I
sure.
have that story where one of my agronomists get held hostage in a supplier farm because because we have not paid the farmer.
Yeah.
And I remember I felt I'm going to have to call his parents and tell them that he's not back for the weekend. And they're going to say, why? And I'm going to have to say, because I haven't done my job. And I was not paying because I had no cash, because the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And as a result,
Yeah.
a decent young man was held hostage in a remote part of the China countryside. And I felt horrible about myself. I felt like I would lay down on the floor and try to breathe. And I realized my office was all glass panels and everybody would see me, and I could not do that. And that stayed with me. So
What's that crazy Frenchman doing in there?
and, and 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 that's so leading is lonely. And because it's lonely, then why do you want to keep on leading lonely? By leading from a point of view of vulnerability, you're saying to people, I don't know it all, but I want to learn it all. And I'm incomplete. We're all incomplete. And I think so. There was an HBR article that was talking about what makes a complete leader. He's got to have strategic sense. He's got to be able to relate to people in a magnificent way. He's got to be able to think creatively in the face of hardship. And there's another one. And what they were saying is we're all good at one, maybe two of that.
Yeah.
Not much more than that. So what happens is that you actually become a complete leader when you accept that to start with, you're incomplete. And that voice is telling you that you're incomplete, and it's true.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it. But then you create a forum, you create that three-legged culture that allows other people to bring what they have to the table, other people who are much better at you than I was, and let them express their views, trust them, watch, hold them accountable. That's still you're still the leader. You're not the friend. But by acknowledging your weaknesses and making them irrelevant, because you're using people who are better at you than you are, better at these things than you are, you're creating a much more powerful team. So I guess the answer to your question is, what do you do with that voice? Well, you don't take that voice as a critique. You take that voice as, this is true. Now, you're not good at that, then what do you do about it? I was not good at solving operational problem in China because I had no context, I had no experience. I was 27-year-old running 1,000 employees in factories in China, government people, farmers, 30,000 farmers were working indirectly for me. And I knew that I had to say, I don't know, but I want to know. I don't know, but I want to know. I want to learn it all. And I let people express themselves. So if you've got that safe space, then you've got intense debate between people. And when you've got intense debate, you can make the complex trade-off that you have to make as a leader, and you make much better decisions. And then it's a positive circle because people gain confidence. They see that the decisions are better. They're more practical. It has a positive effect on everybody's life. And then the next time you have a big trade-off, they will volunteer, they will argue more, they will debate. You should have seen our meetings. They were so loud and so intense, but when the decision was made, everybody fell in line.
I did Xavier, this was, probably going on 15 years now. I did this retreat, and there was all these sorts of different exercises, and there was a lot of not psychotherapy, but I forget what they call it now, but basically where you switch roles with people. And we did this one exercise. I'll never forget this. This was right about the time that I had started my own business. And what you did is you got two people, and you sat in chairs, and the back of the chairs were back to back, so you're facing the opposite direction. And the exercise was to start talking about something that was on your mind, and then the person sitting behind you their job was to listen to what you were saying and then put it into their own words, like essentially restate what you were saying. And so I was sitting here talking about how it was my business. I had just started this business, and I was talking about some of my feelings. And this person sitting behind me who I had never met before this retreat started saying things like, I'm afraid I'm going to fail. I'm afraid that people will think of me as a failure. I'm afraid if my business is not successful, people will think less of me. And literally this person that I had never met before, it was like they were inside my head. They were saying the exact same things that were going through my head. And so for people that are listening to this, most people will realize this, but some people may not. That voice in your head, we pretty much all have it. We all have this voice that it's kind of a critical voice. And there's all sorts of different. I've been a big meditator for 15 years and I'm very interested in the science of the mind and how the mind works and stuff like that. And there's all these different ways you can deal with that voice in your head. One way is to name it, give it a funny name, like, Charlie the Complainer or something like that. And as soon as you do that, like that voice loses essentially all the power it has over you. But what you just said about dealing with that is really amazing. You said something else there, Xavier, about leadership being sometimes it can be a little bit lonely. And what that brought to my mind was the fact that leadership is not a popularity contest. And in fact, I think that the best leaders, there's things that we have to do as leaders that are not pleasant, that are not fun. Like my firm, I'm the one that has to actually fire people, and I hate it. It's the worst thing I do at the business, but I have an obligation to everybody else at the firm to do the hard stuff and to do stuff that maybe other people don't want to do. And, you don't want to be a jerk or completely unpopular with everybody. But if you're worried about being popular with everybody, I don't think you can be a very effective leader over the long term. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, your role is not to be popular. You're saying it extremely well. Your role is to get the company and the organization to this vision that you've set out together and to further the purpose that you've created together. And if to do that, you have to let go of some toxic element or non-performing element for the benefit of everybody else. I'm like you. That's the way I motivate myself when I have to let somebody go. I say, if I don't do that, I'm going to lose the A players that I have in my team.
For sure.
Guess what? You may see it partially that this person is not pulling his or her load, but everybody else suffers because of that, because they have to pick up the slack. So one of the role you have is to be driving really hard this three-legged culture that we talked about and use that to make really difficult decisions. Now, it is lonely, and I did not know it at the time, but I think that's why people have coaches, because we're all really bad at understanding how other people see us and understanding our blind spots.
And you do it just so people listen and know that's basically your primary role now is you're essentially a coach, and you run a consulting business. And again, I'll be candid enough to say that 15 years ago, when I was much more immature and less wise, I thought, who needs a coach? What do you need a life coach for, a business coach? I can tell you, and I can tell everybody listening, that 2 or 3 years ago, I hired a business coach for myself, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And so anybody that's listening to the show right now that's thinking about hiring a performance coach or a business coach or a life coach or whatever you want to call it, I can just tell you from firsthand experience that it's been a phenomenal experience for me. I think part of the reason is people that are intelligent and people that are self-reflective and people that are motivated, they tend to get in these, at least I do, get in these thought loops. And it's really nice to be able to have somebody say, hey, Brian, have you thought about it this way? Have you thought about it this way? And go, oh, wow, man, I didn't even realize that I had these blind spots. And so people have these blind spots, and blind spots by definition you can't see. And so it's nice to have somebody that can open your eyes a little bit, even if you're super successful. I know a lot of very, very, very successful people, wildly successful people that have performance coaches or business coaches. So let's talk a little bit. And by the way, Xavier, I have 2 or 3 things that I really, really want to go over with you. Do you have another 15 or so minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what I want. I want to talk a little bit about some of the consulting and coaching work you do. I want to talk about, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think a lot of people listening to my podcast have been thinking about this, the future of work and where you see the general future of work going. And then also want to talk about, you have a lot of knowledge about food chain supply issues, the digitization of the food chain in China. That's a really, really big topic right now. So, but if it's okay, talk first a little bit, if you don't mind, about the coaching and the consulting business and kind of what you do with that. Like, who are your typical kind of clients, and what do you do with those clients to help them obtain the goals that they're trying to obtain?
Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about that. On the point of everybody needs a coach, there's this great story with Eric Schmidt, who was the chairman of Google for many years, who said that when he became CEO of Google, John Doerr, who was the main investor and who's a legendary investor in Silicon Valley, told him, "You need a coach." And Schmidt took it personally and he got really offended. And he said, "Well, what do you mean? Is there anything wrong with me? I'm an accomplished CEO. I've run multi-billion-dollar companies. Why do I need a coach?" And Doerr's answer was, everybody needs a coach.
Yeah.
We're just all really bad at seeing other people see us. And one of the things I struggled all the time, you can't share with your employees. You know, you're the leader. They look up to you. You can't share your anxiety and anguish. You can share it partially, but not everything with your directors or with your shareholders, because they have a vested interest in the outcome of your decision. They're your shareholders. They're not here to babysit you. And talk about your friends or your wife, they're much more emotionally invested. They always take your side in a short way. And they may not tell you the tough stuff. So the coach has no vested interest in the outcome of your decision. And a good coach should make you really uncomfortable. I've seen it happen last week with a coach friend of mine who was running that meeting with this company, and they had a difficult decision to make about one of their engineer, and they were trying to rationalize it, as we do, you know, but the guy's not so bad, you know, and things are okay. And he asked all these questions saying, okay, so it's not so bad. So this client account is doing amazing, right? It's growing by leaps and bounds. Well, not really. And the client is super satisfied with the service. Well, no, not really. And little by little, people came to the conclusion that there was no other way. They had to let that guy go. And that's what the coach did by, without being aggressive, he just helped them come to a decision. So what I do is because of the nature of my experience, I do strategic consulting, similar to what McKinsey or BCG do, on a small scale, because I'm a small outfit with a partner in China, and I advise usually large multinational, $500 million and plus, on how to grow their business. And usually they already have a business in China or in Asia, and it's usually around food. It can be animal vaccine, it can be meat processing, horticulture, things like that. And these multinationals have complex decision-making process. They need somebody to pull it together and help them think through the different issues. So that's consulting. And I was a bit frustrated because, you know, sometimes multinationals are a bit like Spanish galleons. You tell them right, it takes them 6 months to pivot. And I had a lot of requests of, you know, beyond the strategy, can you help us on the implementation of it all? And I was resistant to get back into the weeds myself. But I discovered that through the coaching methodology, I have been able to really help people and make a difference. So a lot of my clients hire me as a coach beyond the strategy work to coach their teams, and I work with their team, the entire team, and the lead of the team once a month and once a quarter through different meetings where we help them build an organization that is going to scale up fast. And then on the other hand, I have clients who work directly with me who are in the $10 to $50 million range in revenue, who are in that phase where you can't do everything yourself anymore. The entrepreneur has read a lot, tried a lot of things, but he feels kind of overwhelmed, and he can't go beyond that plateau of revenue where he is. And he says, okay, I'll work with you, help me get beyond that plateau and multiply my revenues by 2, 3, 4 in a sustainable and enduring way. So that's what I do here. And I enjoy it tremendously because I find it very rewarding to see that people have improved the way their life is at work thanks to my contribution.
That's awesome. And I'll tell you, I'm totally convinced that most people don't have a very good idea of how other people see them. Like most people, frankly, have all sorts of blind spots, myself included. And so one of the beautiful things about having a coach, I mean, the best athletes in the world have coaches for a reason, not because that coach may necessarily be better at golf or football or soccer. Matter of fact, they're probably not, but it's because they see things that you, the athlete, don't see. So, just an example in my life, I've been training Brazilian jiu-jitsu for the last 2 or 3 years, and there's a 4-stripe black belt, Opiano, who promoted me to blue belt about a year ago, and I couldn't believe it. Like, I didn't think I was ready, and as soon as he promoted me to blue belt, I realized I was, and I had earned it and I deserved it, but I didn't see it. I was, because I'm one of those people that's super critical of myself. So he saw something in me. He saw some abilities that I didn't see, and I think that's what good coaches. That's one of the things that good coaches do, is they can shine light on the blind spots that the leader might not otherwise see. And by the way, everybody, Xavier's website is it's XAVIER-NAVILLE.com, Xavier Naville. It's a great website, by the way. As a guy who's trained in computer science, who's technologically, I've been following tech for 30 years now. I really pay attention to it. It's a beautiful website, but I would encourage everybody, if you want to learn more about some of the stuff we're talking about, to visit Xavier's website. Let's talk now a little bit, if it's okay, because this is super important now. Supply chain issues in general have been in the news a lot lately, and you're kind of an expert in one particular part of the supply chain. So talk a little bit about some of the issues you see with the food supply chain, some of the maybe the solutions, what you kind of see in the future. I mean, human beings have this idea that nowadays the food just appears on your table, but that's historically the story of humans has been mainly famine, feast or famine throughout thousands and thousands of years of human history. It's only recently that we've literally got almost more food than we can consume. So anyway, talk a little bit about some of your expertise and some of your experience with supply chain issues as it relates to the food supply.
Well, it's a very broad question, but let's talk about the current shortages of food in the US. I guess the good news is that there is food. It's just not getting onto the shelves of your supermarket.
Yeah.
Because of a combination of things. You don't have pasta because there's been a drought in Canada, and the durum wheat that is being grown there has dropped by 30% the volume. You don't have a bunch of other foods because global supply chain are disrupted, because the capacity of the factories are reduced. Because of COVID rule, you have to have less density in the factory, so you can have less workers. So, and at the same time, you've got a demand that is, I think, up 13% year on year. So increased demand, constraint on the supply chain, create these bottlenecks that create the shortage. The good news is that the food is here. On the subject of China, one thing I wanted to say is, there's this political environment between the US and China. It's quite tense these days. And nobody can really understand how Chinese look at the world without understanding that China has to feed 25% of the world population with 9% of the arable land. Let's be frank. The geography of America is amazing. It's unique. There's openings to 2 oceans. There's gigantic rivers that facilitate transports. There's incredible amount of natural resource, agricultural resource, and oil and so on. In the case of China, they've got to bring everything from outside. So China has a lot of deserts, a lot of mountains, and a lot of their food have to come in. and the land is extremely precious, and they have to make this complex trade-off. The leadership at the government level has to make this trade-off, saying, if we were completely market oriented, we would only grow vegetables and fruits and meat on this precious land in China. But they have to grow grain, because if for any reason these supply chains that are bringing grain from South America or from the US or from Australia get disrupted, like it's the case today, then you've got people who are going to die of hunger.
For sure. Mass starvation. Yeah.
So they've been through that. If you know a bit of China's history, they've got a number of famines. People in the society in China who are my age know what it is. They grew up in an environment where there was not enough food on the table. And there's always this fear in the back of their mind. So talking about global supply chain, China is in a situation where they have to feed 25% of the population with 9% of the world arable land. They became a net importer of food. In the mind of Americans, they always see China as a cheap exporter of stuff because of
for sure.
labor.
Me included.
And in the case of labor, it's over. China became a net importer of food in 2010. Their exports of food were largely reprocessing of frozen fish that was caught everywhere in the world, brought to China, reprocessed and shipped. I think a third of the frozen fish consumed in the US has been processed in China. Or low value, dry fruits or dry vegetable that you put in soups or instant soups or yogurts and things like that. It's over. This thing has been flat for the past 10 years, these exports of food. I think it's flat at $70 billion. What has been growing tremendously, it's now $160 billion, and it's growing at nearly double digit every year, is the import of food, of super premium food. You're talking olive oil, coffee, wine, Angus beef, and I think the Texas Meat Board was saying a couple of weeks ago that their sales to China have been multiplied by 13 times.
Really?
The first 6 months of this year. You would not believe it when you read the news.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah. No, but, we have this notion of China flooding us with cheap products and cheap labor and all that sort of thing. This is super interesting.
But... So that's something important. So China is going to be a huge consumer of food in the world. And because China is so big, so when you think of China, you have to think of America, the American market with these 400 million people, times 4.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
That's the way you have to think about it.
Yeah.
And when Chinese start to consume milk, entire countries in the world then can't buy milk anymore because they drive the prices up. Consumers start to buy it in huge volumes, and countries in Africa can't source the milk anymore, or they can't source it at the price that they're able to pay for. And you've got the same thing happening today in beef, for example. Chinese are huge pork consumers, and they're realizing that beef is a leaner meat, and they're switching away from pork toward beef. And suddenly, the price of beef is going through the roof everywhere in the world. And Americans are benefiting because we've got this great supply of beef. So it is important to understand that geopolitically, China always has this fear that their food supply chain are going to be interrupted by geopolitical tension, and it drives some of their decisions. That the Chinese people increasingly are buying food from elsewhere, and that there's huge opportunities for food exporters around the world to ship to China. It's not easy, it's always complicated, but it's a huge market. And in a huge market like China, you can find a niche, and it can still be a bigger market than, say, Australia or Malaysia. So the last thing I'd like to say about food supply chain and how it's modernizing in China in a very unique way that we could maybe learn from is that, the retail sector in the US is dominated by 5 players who have 80% of the retail sales. The farming has consolidated over the course of 100 years. You've got giant farms in California, and they're shipping, they're feeding the rest of the US. So you've got a very integrated and mature system. In China, the top 5 retail players, I think, are less than 4% of retail sales. So you've got hundreds of local retail chains who are dominant in a particular town or in a particular region, but they're not dominant like a Walmart or a Kroger or Albertson would be. And then you've got 500 million farmers. So China was 83% rural in the early 80s. Today, China is only 36% rural.
That
But
fast, unbelievable.
so,
Wow.
so, so they've been through a process of modernization over the course of 2 or 3 decades that took us 150 years.
Yeah,
So you can imagine that there's a lot of gaps that have been created in between.
for
Um,
sure.
and um, and but today at maturity, a country that is at maturity would have an urban population that is around 70-75%. So you would say that China today is close to that or getting close to that. But that's still going to be 500 million people operating 9% of the world arable land. The result is less than 2 acres per farm household in China. So tiny little farmers. And what's happening, and in my experience, it was always a nightmare because every time you buy big quantities of food from in China, you're dealing with thousands and thousands of farmers. If one of them does the wrong thing, then suddenly you've got E. coli or food poisoning or
Yeah,
pathogens in your food and people dying.
yeah,
So that's always been a fear of mine. But what's happening today is that instead of consolidating and creating giant farm, because they can't, they've got 500 million people that they have to keep occupied in the countryside. The digital networks, digital platforms in China like Alibaba, JD.com have created these platforms online where consumers can group together online and group purchase and organize an entire truck to come from 2,000 miles away in the countryside with the
wow,
particular type of beef or the particular vintage
wow.
variety of lettuce that they like. And they'll group together online and bring that. And guess what happens is that the farmer who used to sell to a little middleman and he did not know where the food was going, suddenly becomes accountable to the consumer online who is going to rate his food
Yeah,
and tell him what's going on. And now with the TikTok of the world, you've got live streaming happening with the farmer presenting his product and explaining how he grew it. And you've got
yeah,
this giant digital farmers market between 1 billion people in the cities and 500 million farmers that is being created. There's billions of dollars being invested in the digitization of these supply chains in China because that's the way they're going to modernize. They can't consolidate 500 million people any
yeah,
more than what they have today, and they don't have massive retailers purchasing foods like we have in the US. It's all fragmented. So for an operator like me, when I was trying to sell bag salads to retail stores, you're talking 1,000 stores every day that you have to deliver,
yeah,
and thousands of promotion ladies or push girls or marketing ladies in the stores to present the stuff,
yeah,
and incredible complexity and an amount of sales that will not exceed $10 million.
yeah,
Now you compare that with a mandarin grower in California. I think the name is Cuties, the Cuties mandarin.
yeah.
They can go twice a year, meet Kroger and Walmart. They don't even need a sales force. The owner can do that, and he's got a $500 million business.
Wow. Unbelievable. And that dovetails perfectly actually into the last topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the future of work. And I know that's a broad topic, but one of the things I've been a technologist, like I said, I trained in computer science in the early 90s. And so I've kind of seen the development of the internet, the development of all the different cell technologies and all the connectivity. And I've seen that from basically the beginning up until today. And I've always been very optimistic about technology, although lately I look at this phone and I see if I can get it on the screen. There we go. There we go. I look at these bricks that literally every single one of us carries around, and I wonder if it's a net benefit or a net negative. But I was going to ask you, like, as it relates to the future of work, the only thing that and I think about this a lot, Xavier, as a business owner, I want to know what the future of my field is going to look like, and I think about it a lot. But one of the things, and I'm not very sure, frankly, what that looks like. One of the things I am absolutely sure about is it's not going to look today like it's going to look in 5 or 10 years. Things change. That's just almost inevitable. But I was going to ask you with respect to the food supply issues and the future, if technology is something that maybe can solve some of these issues. And you gave a perfect example right there of people getting together using technology and essentially creating little businesses using nothing but their cell phones and TikTok. So talk a little bit about what you see, whether it's in the food industry or any other industries. Talk about what you see as kind of the future of work.
So that's a question that is close to my heart, because the age of cheap China is over. So the idea that China is going to, the world for the past 2 decades has essentially benefited from the low labor cost in China that has been able to offset inflation. And this is over in China. So what will happen today is that China will increasingly invest in robotics, in AI, in order to increase productivity when they make foods. And they will innovate because they've got this giant domestic market. And there's a lot of things that we could learn from them. So a couple of things that I was reading recently is the AI that the bots in China, that Alibaba's bots are using to serve customers, are rated 3 points higher than an individual staffer by the people. So if you've had to deal with bots with your bank's customer service, you have here an experience of something that never answers your question exactly the way you want it, or gives you random answers. They're way more advanced in that sense. Now, of course, it's with Chinese characters, it's not directly replicable here, but that's something that you can learn from. There is a lot of, because China is cracking down on environmental pollution. There's a lot of small industrial kitchens or small food factories that are being shut down and replaced by mobile units with semi-robotized operations inside. I was looking at a small restaurant concept, a cloud kitchen, no later than yesterday, who has small containers that they move around with, and they're using half the stuff that you would use in a normal kitchen. The sanitation is pristine. They're based in China, and they serve all the food to consumers in porcelain bowls. And the first question that came to my mind is, how do you make sure you collect these porcelain bowls and don't lose them? Because everybody will be keeping them. And they've got an AI software. So the delivery man on his next round to deliver from you, he will just simply scan with his phone the bag with the porcelain shop, and it will automatically verify that the number of bowls are there and reconcile your account. So in that sense, there's a lot of innovations that are happening on that side. But what I see going forward with the food supply chain is they're going to be more localized. People have been traumatized by the recent disruptions, and all the people I talk to are looking at building their supply chain closer to their main markets. So you're going to see a lot of things coming back here in the US. And not crossing the world. There's also environmental reason. People are more and more, consumers want to know that the food and ingredients that are in their food have not crossed the world on an ocean trailer. They want to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact on the climate. Now, beyond that, there's all sorts of very interesting technology innovations about reducing waste. In the produce sector, fruit and vegetable, you've got nearly a third of the produce that are lost between the different transportation modes. In the US, it's a bit more efficient than that because it's more integrated, but in most parts of the world, 30% is a fair assessment. So you've got all sorts of solutions that are being created today, leveraging data and AI to better control the amount of waste and reduce our impact on the environment. So I don't know if I'm answering to that on the food side. On the future of work side, I mean, you're talking to the guy who used to be 10 times a year in China and hasn't been able to travel for the past 2 years. And I've had the best year ever last year because I've leveraged tools like like Mural and Zoom that have allowed me to have tremendous impact with people stuck in their home around the world and
Yeah.
participating online on the same Mural board to exchange ideas and form consensus around their strategic direction. So I'm really impressed. As you say, we're never going to come back to the analog world.
Yeah.
I think that when we start to travel, people are going to think twice before they travel. My coaching client, for example, used to be familiar with the process where I travel once a month to see them for half a day, and I travel once a quarter to see them for a full day of work, and once a year for 2 full days of work. Well, today, we're probably going to settle around a rhythm where I travel for the annual meeting, for the planning meeting at the end of the year, and maybe for a couple of key quarterly meetings. But the rest, we're going to do everything online. It's much more practical for everybody. Most clients have decentralized organization now, people working from home,
Yeah.
and we're going to leverage the tools that have worked. So you still need that human interaction and this tension that I talked about in that safe space to make difficult decisions, and it's easier to do that face to face. But it's going to be a balance. I see myself probably doing 60% to 70% of my coaching work online going forward, and the rest is going to be physical.
It's absolutely amazing. One of the major trends that I see, whether you're talking about the food system, whether you're talking about money, finance, whether you're talking about business, is decentralization. So, the whole point of the blockchain and Bitcoin and that kind of technology is it takes out the middlemen, it takes out the governments, and it decentralizes the process a little bit. But I tell you one thing I've been noticing lately, Xavier, is it used to be, I live in Houston, Texas, that on Sundays I would go to the grocery store and buy groceries. And lately that doesn't happen very often. I pull up my phone and I push a couple buttons, and in 2 or 3 hours, the same food I ordered the week before, if I want the same food, shows up at my door. And same thing when you were talking about pop-up restaurants. There's all sorts of pop-up. But for people that don't know what that means, cloud kitchens or pop-up restaurants, basically that means it's a restaurant without a physical location. And there are all sorts of cloud restaurants or pop-up kitchens, or whatever phrase you want to use, in Houston right now. And so what I kind of see is this shift from you going to the food coming to you. And that, of course, with Zoom and the quarantines and all the other mess we've been through over the past couple of years, that trend is not just in food. That trend is everywhere. But it's going to be. I'm personally, I'm super excited about it. I think one of the, if there's any silver lining at all to this global pandemic and some of the related issues, is I think it's shown us that some of the ways we've done things in the past aren't the best way of doing things. So just to give you one example, is the best way for everybody in an organization at 9 o'clock on Monday morning to show up in the same physical structure, to sit there until 5 o'clock, and then to leave and go home and sit in 2 hours of traffic, and then repeat that 5 days a week? Like, is that the best system? And the way I think about these things is, if it's the best system, then we should do it. But I think in large part, a lot of this stuff we do just because we've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. I mean, I have an employee who had an hour and a half commute here and back to my office. And when the quarantine happened, my entire firm went remote, and we're still basically all remote. And she just saved 3 hours a day that she now gets to spend with her kids and her husband, instead of in the car stuck in traffic. And so I'm excited about it. I think, like I said, we're learning that the way we've worked over the last 30, 40 years, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be that way. It can, in fact, it can be much, much better. The big thing I've noticed with the work from home for me personally is I have 3 kids and a wife, and I've gotten to spend a lot more time with them. So not only is that good for me personally, but when I do go to work, I'm much more energized. I'm more motivated. So I'm super pumped up about the future of work myself. But I tell you what, I've kept you longer than we had set aside. And
That was a pleasure.
well, I seriously, I could talk to you. You know, we didn't even get into the fact that you're quadrilingual. We didn't get into your fencing. You're a fencing champion. I really wanted to ask you about that, but what a pleasure. This has been really, really enjoyable. And I got to tell you, I've learned a lot during the podcast. You've told me things that I've never heard before. And I know that my listeners will learn a lot from listening to this. So Xavier, before I let you go, tell people, I've already mentioned it, but tell people where they can find you online, whether it's your website, social media, and just give us your information in case people want to reach out to you.
Okay, thank you for giving me an opportunity. I'm on LinkedIn under Xavier Naville, and
Nice.
I have a website that you gave already, xavier-naville.com. And if people are interested in the coaching experience, I've got an assessment that I take people through to cut through the polite discussion and get to the core of the issues and identify whether there's a chance or a good fit for what I do. So I would welcome anybody to go on my website and take the assessment or make an appointment with me, and we can have a conversation about how I could possibly help them.
Xavier Naville, everybody, the Lettuce Diaries, check it out. Great conversation, great leadership, great ideas. Thanks a lot, Xavier.
Thank you, Brian.